Hey everyone, Casella here. Before we get going, a quick plug. If you are enjoying the show, it would help us a ton if you left us a rating or review wherever you listen. Otherwise, it's hard for new folks to discover us. And another thing, we've got a Strange Horizons guest today, and Strange Horizons are kicking off their annual fundraiser this year. Hard to overstate how much good stuff SH does in the field. Check that out. I will link it in the notes. Okay, on to the show. A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse, he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello, and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jake Casella-Brookins. Every 2 weeks, we take a book, usually a speculative fiction book of some kind, and we ask a writer, a scholar, a critic of some kind to talk us through it, what's noteworthy, strange, good, or off-putting about it. Today we're talking about John Brunner's Stand on Zanzibar, and I am delighted to have Dan Hartland back on the show to discuss. Dan is one of the reviews editors for Strange Horizons, which, if you're listening to A Meal of Thorns and you don't know about Strange Horizons, remedy that right away. Dan's also a reviewer and critic with writing in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Vector, and more. He writes the very cool Snap Criticism column for ARB. And if you've enjoyed him on previous episodes here, then you should also check out the podcast Critical Friends, where Dan talks to reviewers about all kinds of fascinating topics. Dan, welcome back. How are you?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm good, thanks. It's a pleasure to be back. It's always refreshing to talk to you, Casella.
We should have just been recording all of our pre-chat, as we discussed, for bonus episode reasons, but we'll fill people in a little bit. Yeah, what's been going on? What have you been working on? You reading anything good?
Yeah, I am. So not fiction, but I am reading The Illuminated Man, which is Chris Priest and Nina Allan's pseudo-biography of J.G. Ballard, which had just come out. So I say pseudo-biography because in theory, this project began with Priest wanting apparently to write a biography of Ballard, a writer that he's always has always been a lodestar for Priest.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, Priest very clearly is suspicious, as people who've read his fiction might guess, of kind of biography as a genre. And then, of course, sort of a third of the way into the project, I don't know, Priest passed away. So a lot of the book is kind of Allan not finishing it. So she doesn't go into Priest's chapters and expand or revise them. They are as he left them. She kind of adds stuff. So she adds some Ballard stuff. She also adds some Priest stuff. And what emerges is it's kind of a reflection on the way in which biography might or might not affect fiction writing. So it's not really, there's some literary criticism in there. You learn a lot about Ballard's life, although I suspect people who already know about it don't learn a lot. But really this is, it's almost novelistic. Really this is a book about, okay, does life affect the work at all? Does death affect the work? And, it's also a beautiful meditation on sort of loss and grief, of course. So it's a fascinating book. Some reviewers kind of have said, well, this doesn't really work, does it? But I think the not working is feature, not bug.
I like that. I like a nonfiction book that's sort of straddling genres like that to do something a little more.
I'd recommend it. It's really interesting to read, and it takes a lot of turns as well. What about you? Have you been reading it much?
Yeah, I have a big stack I need to get through, of course. I think I've already talked about it on the podcast, but hopefully by the time this episode comes out, the book will be out, and hopefully my review will be out, which is Violet Allen's Prism Plastic Void.
Ah, yes.
Really great. So I just got a finished copy. I'd read like an earlier version of it, and I'm so glad I got the finished copy before I'm done reviewing because, Dan, the things this is doing design-wise, I can only compare it to House of Leaves in terms of the amount of stuff it's doing very different things. All major characters speaking with subtly different font choices, sometimes like not so subtle, doing a lot of different things with how the text moves on the page, doing stuff with color and size and format. Really fascinating. And the book itself is, it's great, but it's, the thing that's fascinating to me about it is it feels like it is taking a few very popular kind of forms. So it's kind of like a a cross-dimensional, slightly time-travel-y, like kind of like doomed romance kind of thing at the core of it. But it is layering on all these layers, I guess, of just really, really deep allusions, and it's very like self-referential, but not in a... When it is snarky, it knows it's being snarky, and it is sort of like flagging to you that it knows it also, so it didn't like rub me the wrong way. It's unbearably clever, but has that over something really, really interesting. Yeah, really dug it.
So that sounds like a book that's walking a very fine line, because you could easily have said a lot of the things you've just said about quite a frustrating, gimmicky, shallow book in a way. But it sounds like it is not that.
Yeah, that's part of what's so fascinating about it. It's like you can read this as like people are going to be selling this. When people are selling this, they're very rightly going to be talking about this is how you lose the time war and maybe something like Gideon the Ninth or something like that. But it's doing really, and it's doing stuff on top of that, but it's doing very different things underneath it in a way that makes it feel like a very different book. I've actually been talking about Avi Mercini's We the Parasites in comparison to it, which is not a novel, which is a sort of memoir criticism hybrid, but it was reminding me of that fairly intensely, like kind of vibe-wise.
Well, I shall look forward to your review, which I believe is appearing in an august organ. It's
recently nominated for another major award, which we've also been discussing in the Lost bonus episode, right?
Yeah. People will be very grateful that that episode was lost, I think.
So yeah, reading that, I just read the next book in Robert Jackson Bennett's mystery, the Anna and Din mysteries, which actually was interesting to. I think it was elevated by having Brunner in the back of my mind, because I think his axe grinding is getting fruitfully louder in those. Like that, he's like, this is about today. This is about stuff going on today. It's about our society. It's not about the fictional society. So that, in a way, that was actually kind of fruitful to read it against.
He is such an interesting author because, of course, I think it was Bennett's first novel, Mr. Shivers. It was all in there back then. What you're talking about, the kind of urgent contemporaneity of it, and yet he's not really received.
No, he's not
in that way.
He's received in this, and I don't hold this against him, and I get why the recent books are getting the buzz they are, but he's sort of received in this, like very, I don't know, kind of schlocky pop author kind of way. But the Divine Trilogies, the Divine Cities trilogy is just like capital C, capital O, colonialism. Let's talk about it. And they're very like pointed and angry about a lot of like intersectional oppression, but you don't hear the words intersectional oppression come up when you're talking about Bennett. So that's interesting. All right, let's move on to things. Today we are discussing John Brunner's novel Stand on Zanzibar. This was published by Doubleday in 1968, although I believe it started publishing the year or two earlier in some sort of serial format, or maybe just parts of it standalone. It's set in the exotic future year of 2010, where overpopulation and rapid social change are major concerns. It is a big novel, like physically big in terms of word count. And while it does have a plot, large sections of the book use a collage approach, giving us clips of fictional popular media, excerpts from reports and internal communications, short chapters on non-recurring or very minor characters. The quote-unquote main plot has two strands, one in which an American company is trying to set up operations in a fictional and mysteriously peaceful African nation, and another in which U.S. military and media try to get to the bottom of a human genetic engineering project in a fictional Asian island nation. So Stand on Zanzibar won the Hugo, the British Science Fiction, and the Pre-Tour Apollo Awards. Brunner was an extremely prolific author. Zanzibar's probably his most famous work. There's another small handful of stuff that people talk to, we'll probably get to. But I think this is the one, when people say Brunner, it's probably the one people think of. Dan, this book, tell me why we decided to talk about it.
Well, because I just kept insisting on it. So so the very first time that you ever emailed me about appearing on this podcast, I think you used the phrase problematic faves as a kind of, let's talk about one of those. And Stand on Zanzibar immediately came to mind because emphasis on the problem part of that phrase, but also because I just have a very strong memory of first reading it. So when I was a kid, my dad had a friend. They'd worked together, and he'd moved back to Ireland. So we used to often visit them around about New Year's. Now, they lived in rural Ireland in West Ireland near Roscommon, and there's not a lot to do out there, right? So I would always take at least one very chunky book. Okay, so I would take, one year I took Three Musketeers, this kind of thing. You go over on the boat or whatever it is, and you stop in Dublin, and then you keep going. So we were in Dublin, and I went to the O'Connor Street branch of Eason's, which is a big bookstore there. And I was just looking through the SF Masterworks, some of which I'd already read at this stage. So this was early on in the Masterworks era. I think it was like 99 or something. And, I'd already read Stars from Destination. I'd already read Forever War, all these kinds of things. And I was like, oh, well, this series must be... And this was one of them. And it had the requisite chunk for days spent in Roscommon when it goes dark at 3 p.m. So I took it and I started to read it, and I was like, What is this? We might get to this, but I wouldn't call it an immersive book. I would call it an immersed book. And there's a slight difference in the way in which the reader experiences that. But I did experience it. Like it seems like a book saturated in itself, which is when you're a kid expecting to get The Star's My Destination, and then you get this, strikes you. And it struck me in all kinds of ways, not all good. But therefore, it's always stayed with me as a kind of example of one of those kind of SF masterworks, not just those works that appear in the series, but in general, these books that are touted as the best of the genre. As an example of one of those that, maybe we should think about what we mean when we say that. So that's why I've made you read it.
Uh-huh. So I had read this before. It'd been a long time, and I read this in a period, probably in my, I might have been 19, maybe early 20s, where I was doing some self-guided, very homework feeling, I want to learn more about science fiction.
Uh-huh.
And so reading stuff that I wouldn't have otherwise maybe sought out, and including stuff that felt like more work. But I was also I was at a stage in my life where I kind of wanted that. Because I read this, I think I read Voyage to Arcturus. I read a couple other big ones where I'm like, this is when I read William Hope Hodgson's Nightlands, a lot of this kind of stuff. So I was in I'm ready to read a big chunky thing that's maybe not super enjoyable all the way through, but you kind of feel like you feel like you're doing something,
Uh-huh.
I haven't really thought about this book terribly much. I read a fair amount of other Brunner just because he was so prolific that in the used places I was haunting, there would often be some little tiny Brunner mass market. Of which there are, I meant to look up the total number, but I want to say he wrote 60-some novels other than this, none of which have stuck in my head, except for the four they call the Club of Rome quartet, which I don't know how much we want to talk about Club of Rome. We might come back to that. If people aren't familiar with that term, that came out after this, a year or two after this, which was a big report about overpopulation that was very controversial and is still.
Yeah, so he did this one, which was about it's done on Zanzibar, which is about overpopulation. He did Sheep Look Up. He tackled the four kind of climate change and these sorts of things. Yeah, in a very kind of conscious way. This book is about this.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to a lot of things in this book, but I kind of want to start with that question of literariness of it and it's sort of how it has aged on a few different axes. This is a book that's and Brunner is a person that science fiction nerds of a certain type love to reference.
Yeah.
I don't know how much he has actually read. And reading this book, I think you can kind of see why. I think if you maybe wanted to get people to read Brunner, maybe we would have picked Shockwave Rider or something like that. But I don't know why this book is 550 pages for the effects it's trying to achieve, other than that, Dos Passos wrote big books, and I don't really know if there's another answer. I feel like you could achieve everything this is trying to do generously at half the length. I really think you could, except maybe for some of that immersed feeling that you have to be in it so long.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it lends itself its sort of own inescapability, which is a theme that a lot of the characters are feeling as well.
It does, exactly. So I think that there's a lot going on in terms of the kind of length and the rideliness of it, right? So First of all, Brunner had, as you say, a very prolific career, and an awful lot of his books are not like this. And in fact, so you mentioned that this novel was serialized before it was published as a whole, and it was serialized in 1967 in New Worlds, which is famous as the house journal of the New Wave. Brunner himself was associated with the New Wave, but in a kind of way that some of those who were part of it as well was suspicious of him, because he was seen to be a little bit too Americanized. A lot of his previous novels were seen to be a little bit pulpy, and he was viewed as someone that was switching the way he wrote to kind of get in on the new thing. And as you mentioned, sort of Dos Passos, John Dos Passos, who, famous for the USA trilogy, wrote these 3 books, USA trilogy, which was meant to be a kind of look at the 20th century, the first sort of X decades of the 20th century in the US, in a very similar way to the way in which Brunner decides to write Stand on Zanzibar. In other words, the USA trilogy is split similarly into kind of 4 different types of chapter. Camera Eye, which is kind of a semi-autobiographical stream of consciousness. There's another one where headlines from the news are pulled out, which Brunner does in Stand on Zanzibar. There are chapters which are from characters' perspectives, which kind of tell a story, which we get in Stand on Zanzibar. And then there are extracts from various texts, which again we get in Stand on Zanzibar, specifically a lot of extracts from text written by a guy called Chad Mulligan, who is maybe a Brunner stand-in. It also kind of resembles, sort of Timothy Leary from the 60s, in which, so kind of he bores on a lot about opinions he has. And we can get back to what this book thinks and whether it thinks what it says it thinks. But in general, the book is a project. It's deliberately written, I think, to try and win some cred with the New Waves guys, with the literary faction that love Dos Passos and don't write science fiction. What's interesting about it is, of course, it works because it wins the Hugo. And I'm not sure, I haven't gone back and looked at this. I'm not sure why this was. I'm not sure whether Brunner's existing readers read this and thought, wow, man. Or where, in a sort of, the way that people had listened to Please Please Me, and then 4 years later they got Sgt. Pepper's, and they were like, wow. Or whether he attracted a whole new readership, whether he did ride the zeitgeist as he was accused of trying to do. All I do know is that you're right. This is the book that seems to have lasted. People think Brunner, they think Stand on Zanzibar. Some of that is because it was included in the Masterworks series.
Got the tour essentials, right here, yeah.
Exactly. So it keeps getting reprinted. Some of it, I think, is because of, as you say, a certain kind of science fiction reader likes to cite it. I think because it's often seen as very quote unquote prescient. It imagines things that, to one extent or another, you can see happening. I'm not sure it is prescient in that sense, but maybe we can come back to that too. And then finally, I do think that it remains just quite an idiosyncratic book, and therefore it sticks in the brain. Whether or not you liked reading it, it has, on the page, like in terms of its structure and how it's written, it has a voice.
I hate to damn something this way, but there's something there since I first read it, and then since I've read more of Brunner, read more about Brunner. So I encourage people to check out, if you're interested, the Modern Masters of Science Fiction series, which are those nice little tiny kind of like critical biographies. Jad Smith has one on Brunner that's really, really good, and they're very short. They're good, but there's something kind of tragic about Brunner generally, and I think this book specifically, in sort of being a, kind of a missing link.
Yes.
Where you look at someone like Vonnegut, who is doing something very similar to this, but sort of achieves lasting fame outside of genre bounds as well as within. And then very shortly after this, you get someone like Gibson, who again has some very similar concerns, clearly being influenced a bit by this, right? But both achieves more commercial success, and I would guess will have longer lasting literary value, just because there's a, I don't want to say this book lacks craft, but for all that it's trying to do this very big thing, when you're actually reading it, it's not that it's like howler after howler, but it feels a bit forced to me. It doesn't feel very artistically integrated in the way that I might point out something I know he has his haters. But like, I think Kim Stanley Robinson does some very similar things, which, if you're into it, I think work very well. Where again, like this book, like I get what it's trying to do. I see what it's trying to do. I kind of respect what it's doing. It doesn't quite come together organically for me. And again, that's that feeling like, I feel like you could have achieved this at 250 pages, but instead I had to read 550.
So, I mean, let's talk about the structure then. So, yes, obviously, you mentioned that it has a quote-unquote core story, which follows these two guys, Norman and Donald. Right? And they get involved in various ways in the geopolitics of this world. This world, which for Brunner was kind of 50, 60 years hence, and has basically broken into kind of three blocks that we see, at least. The US is very dominant. Both Norman and Donald are Americans abroad, right? And we very, very much see the world, this Stand on Zanzibar world, through those American eyes. I think that this is a book that makes certain assumptions about who is going to read the book and who it needs to convince of what it wants to convince them of. But structurally, braided around those two core narratives, which I agree, you could tell it in 250 pages. I mean, generously, right? What happens is we meet Donald and Norman. They share a flat because they share an apartment in New York because, like, in this overpopulated world, which is a key theme of the book, even the most well-remunerated people in New York City have to share apartments. So they share this apartment. They don't really know each other that well. They get to know each other a little bit. It turns out Donald, spoiler, is a spy of some sort, and Norman is a vice president of a big company that that owns a computer that knows everything, right? And it is impossible, sort of not to think about AI in this. And, that certain kind of Brunner reader would say he was prescient about LLMs, right? Like, so these two people then get sent by their respective organizations to different parts of the world to mess around there in the interests of the US hegemony, which I don't think Brunner's in favor of.
Right.
I don't think he thinks that's great. I think he thinks it's awful. I think it's part of this book is about the evils of dehumanization. We can come back to that because I think it, in showing the evils of dehumanization, I think it commits dehumanizations. Anyway, but the rest of the book, braided around this very basic narrative, is, as you say, on one level completely unnecessary, and on many levels not always great. Well written. So there are, as well as the headlines from various publications and TV broadcasts, interactive TV broadcasts, because a certain type of Brunner reader would say that Brunner was prescient about social media. And there are also little vignettes, little short stories about other characters in the world. Some of these are really, I think, quite good. So
yeah, agree.
And some of them are awful.
Also agree.
Right?
Yeah.
So on that level alone, some of this stuff could be cut. But this would not be the novel it is if you just followed Donald and Norman on their sort of almost pulp fiction quests.
Right.
Those are the sections, in my view, that Brunner calls them the continuity chapters, which is the main narrative. Those are the sections that read most like other Brunner novels to me. They are pulpy, they have lots of action, in fact, some pretty significant violence. The other sections, for me, are what give the novel, counterintuitively, given that we're saying that they're raggedly written, they're what gives Stand on Zanzibar its legs. We only remember this book because, in part, of its failures.
Yeah, if you just had the Donald and Norman chapters, this would feel very much like one of the what do I want to call them? Like the least Vonnegut's, right? Like, we're just like, you kind of get this goofy thing that kind of makes you question the purpose of everything, right? It would read like a planet-bound Sirens of Titan or something, like a very broad satire. And I think there are elements particularly in the Beninian line that feel very Cat's Cradle, feel very Buchananist, but it is all the other stuff that makes this novel what it is. And I want to come back around to that dehumanizing. Back to that like feeling of kind of tragic. And what's interesting about this, like, this is a theme that lots of science fiction writers picked up, right, and pick up still. you get this intense sense, yet Brunner is worried about this. He is worried about serving the machines. He's worried about sort of what we become. But there's a despair to it that turns mean-spirited.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that to come around to, like, you never get that from Vonnegut. I was thinking a lot about 334, about Dish's work, which is a couple years after this, which very similar world, very similar setup, but filled with such a deep pathos for even its really awful characters. And this, you just don't really get that. There's like a little tiny swing at the very end where you feel like he's kind of like forgiven a few characters, but by and large, you just get this sense of kind of disgust. And the way it approaches overpopulation is on an aesthetic level. He's not worried that there are too many people for the planet to support. He's worried that there's too many gross people on the subway with me, is kind of the way he's thinking it.
So the book, you're right. So the book is pessimistic. It is too pessimistic. And Brunner wasn't alone in this. So Stand on Zanzibar was published in exactly the same year as Ehrlich's Population Book.
Yeah, right.
Right? So it is part of that culture, that sociological moment. And that's one way we can think of this book. We can think of it not as a kind of novel to kind of read as an entertainment, but as a document of how people were thinking at that time, or some people were thinking at that time. It was definitely a thing. But the pessimism leads Brunner to make certain sets of assumptions which are simply wrong. So he sees problems, and this works against the prescience argument. He finds it very difficult to see solutions. Very difficult. The only solution in the book rests on one of the dehumanizations that it perpetrates, which is towards the people of Beninia, this strangely fictional African country. I don't know why he does this. So both of the parts of the world to which our American daring doers go are fictional. So Norman goes to Beninia, as you say, to kind of make it effectively a colony of the corporation for which he works. And Donald goes to Yadakang, which is a kind of South Asian, very Indonesia-like place, where he's got to figure out whether the great claims they're making for a great biological advance that they've made in gene editing, essentially, is right or wrong. Because, again, maybe he's prescient. The Americans do not want any Southeast Asians to have like a technological advance on them, heaven forfend. So what happens in Beninia is that one of the indigenous populations of Beninia, the Xinca, it turns out, are so genetically different to all other human beings that they literally secrete a pheromone, it seems, that calms people down. So in this world, the planet is so overpopulated that everyone hates everyone else. And I do think that, talking about the immersedness of this book, the fact that it is full of disgust, we should ask ourselves, is that Brunner's disgust, or is it he just wants us to feel that disgust that defines this world? I'm not sure that there is a meaningful separation between the two in effect, but nevertheless, because this world is defined by disgust, mutual disgust between human beings. In the Xinca, these fictional people that are treated almost like aliens by the book. It could be, it's not, because great hullabaloo was made that this wasn't set in space, right? Because science fiction is serious now, so it's set on planet Earth. In a space set book, they would be an alien species that you could take something from. They're not. They're Africans. Not great, John. But that's the only solution he can see for the problem he sets up. This problem of a planet in which everyone hates everyone else. It's riven by violence. There are these people called muckers. No one understands why, but they simply go berserk in crowds. And again, certain readers of Brunner have said this is prescient, that it imagines everything from terrorism to school shootings. And I just think that's facile, that muckers are not that. But they exist, and they are very violent, and no one understands it, but they all basically think, oh, well, it's because of overpopulation. And what we find is that, yes, the Xinca people might offer the only possible solution to this problem. And in fact, the only reason that the 2010 that Brunner imagined didn't come into being is because people are actually better than Brunner thought they are.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to say in 2026 when, the times are what they are. But ultimately, we don't live in this world in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason for that Brunner could not foresee because he was so pessimistic.
It's really weird to read books and you see movies from this particular era, the Soylent Green kind of phobia of closeness, because I guess just because it feels to me like a somewhat understandable position, but kind of a historical anomaly that you would think it's weird to live closely with other people, which is like the norm for all human existence. Not in cities as big as we have today, but like most people have lived very close to other people and will, like, that's what we are. But this book just has such a visceral disgust about it. He has a line about he's talking about New York, and he says, not cities in the old sense of grouped buildings occupied by families, but swarming ant heaps collapsing into ruin beneath the sledgehammer blows of riot, armed robbery, and pure directionless vandalism. And it's just that is the problem that the book's addressing. It's not really overpopulation. It's just I'm too close to too many people. And you see this, like I said, you see this in The Population Bomb, you see this in Make Room, Make Room. It's just an odd kind of thing. And I think it happens at an odd sort of moment of increasing urbanization and this fear of a return to the city that's happening at this time. That's just kind of hard to wrap my head around. I get it, but I don't really know what to make of it or what to do with it. And I think because it, the big theme that, like, when people say, "Oh, this is the book about overpopulation," I'm like, is it though? Mm. Is it about carrying capacity? Is it about how many hectares we're using for farmland? Is it about the sewage systems? No, not really.
Right. And that's exactly right. Those are the kinds of solutions that it could look to. And you're right, someone like Kim Stanley Robinson would. Mm-hmm. Brunner doesn't, because Brunner just assumes that people are bad. But one of the reasons he thinks they're bad is because they are cruel to each other. And we should be aware of, or at least sort of understanding of, some of the things that Brunner had just lived through. Mm-hmm. So Brunner has lived, 1968, Brunner has lived through civil rights. Brunner has lived through the horror in the South that, we might have to treat other people with a modicum of the same respect we expect to receive ourselves. He is saying in this book, I've just said that he doesn't see solutions. One of the solutions he does suggest, and you're right, it's towards the end of the book when he's trying to think, how do I forgive a few people, is just that we're nicer to each other. Mm-hmm. And there are often parts of this book where people do awful things. So, for example, at one point, Donald, who we come to understand in a kind of Johnny mnemonic kind of way, has been, the book calls it, ectified by his employers, the government, to be able to be kind of a expert assassin at a moment's notice. He commits some really bad, violent acts in this book. In one of the main set pieces of the book, it's about a third of the way through, I think, there's a big riot. He finds himself part of a riot. This is because he's gone out in New York City past 6 p.m., which people don't do in 2010, right? And he does bad things. And then at the very end of the chapter where this happens, what Brunner has these characters often do, because Norman also kills someone, they say, well, that was a bad thing to do, wasn't it? Effectively, he gets characters often to self-reflect and say, I shouldn't have done that. As if he's giving everyone the capacity to reflect if only they would, and this would prevent stuff. So I think that the book is conscious of a potential for avoiding these sort of problems between humans, but it is very, very skeptical to the point of cynicism and pessimism about real humans' capacity to behave differently, which again, I think actually is his big error. It's if you're talking about his prescience, he wasn't. Mm-hmm. Because people, to some extent, and we're seeing a pushback on that now, but to some extent in the years since, some people figured out how to live better together. Might have lasted for a brief period of time, but there was a possibility of it in some places.
I kept coming at this very specifically, just sort of accidentally, biographically in my life, with this really intense desire to argue with Brunner, and for that matter, just to show Brunner that, like, no, actually cities rule. Cities are great. which I mean, that's a big cultural shift, right? Like, at least, I don't know if it's the same in the UK, but, in the US, we had famously, had white flight out of the cities, and this sort of, our politics are very controlled by this fantasy of what rural life is like, right? That's very opposed to where people actually live in large quantities. I had a very hermited winter here, where I was we had really heavy snowfall. I was really busy. I did not get out much this winter. Just, reading bad news around the world, getting real depressed about the human race. And then I went down to New York City. I got invited actually to a talk. Vajra Chandrasekera was doing a talk down in New York City. And I went down. I was in New York for like 48 hours. And I was off the train for like 20 minutes. And 2 million people speaking 500 languages walked by me. And I was like, no, this is worth like dying in a trench for. Like this,
Yes,
this is like pinnacle. This is pinnacle shit. This is like as good as humans get. And it's beautiful and it's great and it's invigorating. And so it's strange to read a book that is just kind of a thesis against that.
It is. I mean, again, if I were trying to read Brunner sympathetically, I might say he's not against it. He just doesn't think it's possible.
Right.
And there's similar. You can also look outside of kind of US context. There are, for some reason, right? There are some French colonialists in this book that remember how great it was. In Algeria, and they spend their sections. They're in the vignette chapters, and they pop up every now and then. And they spend their sections going, "Oh yeah, it was great back in the day." And yes, those people still exist in 2026, much less 2010. And yes, they are often very loud. But in Stand on Zanzibar, there is no break. It feels as if that energy has never dissipated, has never even weakened. And in fact, if we look at the state of many African countries, which Brunner decides not to visit, he just invents one instead, there are some serious success stories there too.
Yeah.
That he simply does not allow for.
I was just going to say those, the chapters with, I'm blanking on their name, Janine and... Are they the Clodards? Is that what they are?
Right, yes.
I was just laughing because they're fascinating. And I actually think those, along with a few of the other interstitial interjections, are part of what allow me to read this book more sympathetically.
Sure.
Because you only include those characters to flag that this is awful. They don't really serve any other purpose. They don't really interact with the plot, right? Like they apply and are denied for a job with Norman's company at the end, but that's the extent of their crossover. But they're just there to be like, people who have this feeling of hierarchical superiority are deeply sick. And that's the only function that those couple chapters serve. But it's not that I want there to be a hope punk ending to this. It's not that I want there to be like a shining character that kind of comes through and we're rooting for in the end. But the way that sort of deep disgust all throughout it just has no counter other than this bizarre Pollyanna-ish, just be nice to each other thing, is what's so strange. And some of it's this feels like a book that is possible to say this book is very much about racism and is very much about the oppression of women. But the utter lack of it, like grappling consciously with it or having any character who speaks out of it or against it, makes me not sure what to do with it. Because they do just what they call women shiggies. They just sort of like dismiss half the population. And it has sections that are so intensely drenched in racist language that given how consciously it's structured, I'm just not sure what to do with them. Especially, I think, and I'll just flag this and then hand it back over, but how carefully this avoids most other cuss words. Like to inventing what are they, like whale dreck and like avoiding, they don't say the word hell. It avoids saying the word hell. But then we'll have we'll have a paragraph where every other word is a racial epithet. And I don't know what to make of that. I don't know what to do with that.
So I don't know whether you're thinking of the paragraph I'm thinking of in which this is the case. It is the paragraph, the one I'm thinking of is the paragraph which consists of orders to soldiers from the Pentagon. It's awful. Like, it almost, reading that paragraph made me think, maybe we shouldn't be talking about this book, right? On the other hand, Pete Hegseth is currently Secretary of War.
Mm-hmm.
And, some of the absurd machismo that we get from him right now is reflected in this stuff. And again, I'm not sure that Brunner presents that paragraph for any purpose other than saying, this is sick.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, again, is that he doesn't think that any of us are really capable of escaping that sickness. And this, at the very end of the book, I mean, among the last lines of the book, Chad Mulligan, who I mentioned is the kind of tune in and drop out character who we read at the beginning of the book, everyone thinks he's dead. He's become this quasi-mystical philosopher whose texts are read by, hippies and whatnot. He's in this crowd of people and terrible things are happening. And he just says, he's a very cynical creature, we think. But then he comes out and says it. He says, I love you. I've tried not to, and I can't help it. I love you all. And then he's led away by someone. And I just read that as Brunner saying, but there's no solution. There's no escape to it. And I think that is a problem. And we should talk about the misogyny too, because you're right. So I don't think all women in this novel are shiggies. So it's
like a class of,
they're
a large class, but a class.
A large class, yeah. There are also women. I think the largest corporation is led by a woman, I think.
Yep, GT.
Right. But they... these characters don't, by and large, command the page, because I'm not sure Brunner knows how to do that. So he's much better at describing what he calls nippy caps than he is, we don't need to unpack that, than he is at describing a woman CEO, right? And that's on him. Like, I feel like I'm spending a lot of this conversation going, hey, what if we look at it from this angle? I don't think you can look at this novel from a feminist angle and come out satisfied. That's a big problem too, because, hey, maybe the solutions that you can't figure out, maybe they are contained in the half of the population that aren't in this novel, at least partly. So yes, I think those are big problems for the book. And as I said earlier, it sets out from a very white male American perspective. And in that sense, thinks that it's being very right on. And hey, look, fellow white male Americans, look at this thing that you may not have considered. Other people are human too. There is literally a line in this book, I think early on, actually. So the president of Beninia, who is President Abomi, is described very early on. And I am sure that Brunner thought he was being very, very clever when he did this.
Oh, when he does the bit of geophrenology?
Yes, he does. He says, he says, he's Abomi he's mixed heritage, right? So Brunner, this is Brunner now, invader down to the eyes, native from there on south, but the eyes themselves, that made the dividing line, was simply human. And that when Brunner wrote that line, he was like, yeah, that's the stuff. Mm-hmm. And it ain't the stuff, right?
No, right.
It's not as radical as he thinks. Mm-hmm. But that's because of who he's assuming he's writing for, I suspect in part. And that's a big problem for the book.
There are actually parts of this, and I don't want to dwell on this because I need to go through line by line. There are parts of this where this doesn't feel very convincing to me as a USA. I think there's some odd little tiny background, tiny little things just in kind of Brunner's assumptions that don't quite click for me as American. One of them just being that, although it has this very American feeling macho kind of thing going on, I think if we want to, we could talk more about the violent sequences and how very closely they hew to a sort of pulp chauvinist sort of model, to the point that I think Brunner is actually having some fun with us a little bit.
I think he is, yeah.
Particularly when we see Donald at the very end, when he's sort of like a shell of himself. And he offers to show his super spy moves, but then, that feels a lot like the not very well adjusted guy, who's taken 2 Krav Maga classes, the fact that he is just literally just an armchair philosopher who then gets injected with super spy serum, basically, it feels so obviously a fantasy. But to backtrack from that feels like a very American thing. The fact that, as you point out, this is a vision of the kind of male white supremacist vision that people like Hegseth and people in the U.S. administration right now are very much visualizing, but which in fact is not the reality of the country and hasn't been,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That feels very American. But little things about like the uncontested nature of the eugenic legislature, the widespread acceptance of mandated abortions, the fact that America has universal health care. Some of these things just feel like kind of assumptions that don't quite click with my feeling of America, even from the 70s. And granted, like, right, this is pre-Reagan, right? So like maybe I'll give it some slack for that. But that tension was sitting with me a little bit.
That's so fascinating because, of course, Brunner was British. We haven't mentioned that. Brunner was British. And it's so interesting that, so obviously I'm British, so I'm reading this thinking, oh, well, he doesn't capture the rest of the world. And you're reading this thinking, oh, he doesn't capture the US either, which that's, so interesting. I agree. Again, of course, it's pre-Reagan. It's all of this stuff. But yeah, again, we are often told how prescient he was. And, this is one of the problems about older science fiction. It is often read to go, hey, he got that right. Hey, he got that right. And no, they didn't. They didn't. No one did. Because that's not the thing that we're trying to be doing here. And I guess that does ask the question, do we need to read this old stuff at all? Right? Like, what are we getting? What did you get from rereading this book? What did I get from rereading this book? I'm not sure how to answer that, other than, I'm quite a historicist sometimes in my readings. I like to contextualize. I like to see where things go. You're right that this is clearly cyberpunk avant la lettre, right? Like, which is fascinating for me to track that. And I thought what you said about Brunner being this sort of tragic missing weak link as well, spot on. Like, here is a guy who's trying to make science fiction something else, and in some ways he does prefigure some of the stuff that happens that you and I really like about what happens to science fiction after this book, but he doesn't quite get there himself, which itself is just an interesting thing to do, but it doesn't make the book a piece of literature worth re-experiencing, which, we were talking about the USA trilogy by Jos Passos. You can still read that and get energy from it. I'm not sure, do you get energy from this?
Yeah, not really.
Yeah.
It's like, to me, this feels like this gives a flavor of a mindset and like text. Like if I were a scholar of, population phobia, right?
Sure.
Like this is just pick any 2 pages here, and there's a thesis in there, right? There's just so much stuff in here. But that goes back to like what I was saying at the beginning. It's something about this doesn't quite cohere artistically in a way that I think you can make this form do it. And I don't know to what extent maybe Brunner is sort of too artificially trying to pick up what he's doing structurally and formally here, and just hasn't quite integrated it yet. Because I was thinking, like, there are kaleidoscopic or mosaic novels that I think are like height of the form. Again, I love KSR. I think people would say, China Mountain Zhang, right? Like,
sure.
There's a novel that expresses a vision of a future using very similar techniques. And I'm sure that people are going to keep coming back to that one for pleasure, in a way that probably people will not keep coming back to this for pleasure. But that's, I don't know, that how things age or don't age, that's a weird...
It is.
We're gonna keep reading Frankenstein, right? Like, but Frankenstein rips, right? Like, for at least another couple hundred years, that's gonna be where the money's at.
I was just gonna say on Frankenstein, it's so interesting. I mentioned the original run of SF Masterworks. This was number 15. It came out, and they published 2 a month in the first years. This came out in the first year of Galantz's original SF Masterworks run. It took 100 titles on the reissue series for them to choose to republish Stand on Zanzibar. Frankenstein was published before it. And I think that tells a story of how badly it's aged even since 1999. I think the answer is badly, but I agree with, how do you gauge that? How do you think about it? Because in some ways, as we've said, there is some prescience in here. There is some interesting sort of historical literary activity going on. I also think that, there's an element of this is a sociological text. I'm not sure it's predicting things so much as it's just aware of how societies work on some level. Brunner's done some reading or whatever. which is then why it's so useful as a sociological text
Yeah,
now.
right.
It's baked into the structure, it's baked into how it's written. But ultimately, yes, it just doesn't hit as a work of fiction.
I think the period 70s through early 80s where we tend to get really hyped about the prescient nature of the books in that period
Sure.
is also just a period of intense cultural change. And if you look at non-science fiction works from that period, you pick it up too, right? Like, I remember the first time I watched the film Network, and I was like, this is cyberpunk, right? Like, this is concerned with exactly the same stuff, right? Like, he's opening this, like, right, like quoting McLuhan, right? Like, to open it up. This is just what's happening then, not predicting the future. And like, I think the prescient's, like, as much as it's fun to say, like, this person predicted an iPhone or whatever like that, what I find kind of more impressive about this is the parts that are most prescient about this are not its specific things that happen so much as the interstitial chapters feel like reading social media on a bad day.
They absolutely do.
They really, really, really do. Half a century or more earlier. And that's interesting. Yeah.
That little anecdote of yours where you had a lung winner, snowed in Buffalo, and you managed to get into the city in the spring. This is the book of the lung winner.
Mm-hmm.
This is the book where you sort of sit there and you doom scroll and you feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
What this lacks is the spring, is because it doesn't see it. It can't see it through the doom scrolling that it's doing. It is absolutely like going through a social media feed. And everyone in this book, or most people in this book, have access to an interactive TV, which enables them to do something similar to doom scrolling. And I think you're right. There's something about the culture of the writing that perhaps is the most interesting thing about it. But it's still raggedly written.
Yeah. There's something there. I'm trying to think how to say this. Comparing this to something like Make Room, which is, I think, much more mean-spirited. Really, I really do, Or comparing this to something like 334, which I think, maybe we should have just talked about 334. Again, to go back to that, like, very, very similar to this novel, but more humane. I don't want to say this. This is, Brunner thinks he's right about this stuff, but that gives him no solace.
Right.
And that he doesn't let it give him any solace is a sort of redeeming note for the book.
It is.
Because no one stands aside for it. There's a really, that's a really common thing, even today, right in like, what's that god-awful, is it Yellowstone?
Yes.
There's all these TV shows where, like, you have a cowboy who's sick of everything, but he can tell you the real story. And he doesn't have any solutions, but he's somehow, like, above it all because he can identify the sickness of modern society. Chad Mulligan has identified the sickness of modern society, but he's not separate from it. He's not above it. He's not better than it because he's called it. And that adds this tiny little kind of redemptive note of it that, like, Brunner's like, yeah, I'm in the room with you at least. It would be cool if he would open a window and actually look outside at everything else going on, but at least he's in there with us.
Yeah, and that brings us back to that kind of sense of the book as immersed in itself. Although we are saying, it's a real problem for this book that Brunner can't imagine an escape, the fact that he can't does give the novel its character. It is a complete thing. It's an end-to-end experience because, as you say, Brunner's in it with you. That there isn't that, like something like you talked about Dish earlier, like Camp Concentration, right? So the main character in Camp Concentration, and it goes badly, spoiler, but has a kind of an ironic distance. There's no ironic distance here.
Yeah.
And I kind of, I won't say I admire that because actually I think it makes the book quite nasty, but it is inevitably an integral part of the book's effect. I'm not sure that is going to convince anyone that they should go out and read this, but nevertheless, that seems to me very much part of its character.
I was thinking through this a lot of the Timothy Leary-ness of it, Mulligan as a character, as this sort of authorial stand-in who's kind of the one of the rays of hope, sort of, a little bit.
Ish.
And a funny thing is, like, in addition to, like, 334 maybe being a more humane version of this, I was thinking about Transmetropolitan a lot through this, with Spider Jerusalem feeling like a direct line from there. And that's a book that has a ton of disgust, right? And, like, really wants to make a part of it, but also has all those sequences of kind of just reveling in how great modern life is, right? And like going to the supermarket, going to these weird raves, and like, it's great what we can accomplish. I should probably borrow the going rogue foghorn when talking about Ellis.
There's a friend of mine in the town where I live who was a huge fan. He used to say he'd built an armchair of sort of copies that he used to sit in. And yeah, when the news broke, he was absolutely, I met him in the street and he was about to burn his throne. Anyway, the writer that I was thinking of was outside of the genre entirely. It's James Ellroy.
Oh,
There are parts of particularly Donald's narrative which do read like something from the Cold 6000. That kind of hard-bitten pulp sensibility, of course, but also the kind of disgust at people. And then, as you say, the almost reveling in how horrible it all is. But Ellroy is such a great stylist. He's developed his own way of approaching it. And this doesn't hit that. The other thing, of course, to note is that Ellroy is a deeply conservative writer. And ultimately, something about Stand on Zanzibar, even though I'm sure at the time everyone thought, as I said, it was very right on, it saw the truth of things. It's a pretty conservative book. Ultimately, because the horror that it has is a horror of others.
I think it is hard to do something non-conservative when fear and disgust are sort of your only motivating.
Right?
Yeah, just can't picture it. We should take a quick break. We've been going real good. I'm gonna grab a drink of water. I'll be right back. All right, we are back. We are still talking about Stand on Zanzibar. It's a big old book. We could keep talking about it for a long time. One thing that I have been, I'll just say, anticipating with some amount of dread, talking about is the overpopulation discourse and the eugenics, which are central to this. And like as I have said, I think you've said as well, that there's a level that this is more concerned with the aesthetic side of that than the logistics of it all. But I think, putting this alongside the population bomb, which was a like this book, they have their math wrong, right? So in that sense, they're not on. They're neither prescient nor scientific in that way. But I think to kind of focus on that a little bit, I don't know. It's something I find fascinating because, and we can split this into like the obviously much bigger and more important concerns in the real world with things like climate change and international policies of various types, but also specifically in genre where, climate fiction is maybe a genre dividing event. Maybe, we will look back, in 40 or 50 years and say, aha, things really, really kind of split here. This is something that I know you and I have talked about. Lots of critics and reviewers and readers talk about that. There are large strains of climate fiction that do not overlap much traditionally with science fiction, for obvious reasons, right? Because it is in the news, it has been in the news, it's in writers' minds, whether or not they're coming from SF. I see very few people talk about population seriously, whether in the more genre or less genre sides of climate fiction. And I see very few people talk terribly seriously about eugenics, maybe just because they mostly avoid that word and just talk about genetic engineering instead. But I don't know what to think about it. It's a topic that I feel like is a little bit taboo, just because if you say the word overpopulation, if you think that is real, then the solution, of course, involves ethnic cleansing, or involves eugenics. It's hard to think of a way to how do we have a conversation about this without even bringing that up. But it frustrates me. I've been in the audience like at panels on hope punk and solar punk and climate change where people say, well, there is no overpopulation problem. I'm like, well, that's an empirical question. I have a lot of hope that just focusing very strongly internationally on human rights, that we will get around the worst parts of that question, because when people have bodily autonomy and legal rights and education, birth rates tend to go down to sustainable levels, so it kind of like it nullifies the need for more extreme ideas. But I feel like there's this real fear to engage with it, and even the kind of climate change and hope punk and solar punk that I like more often feels the need to duck around the question. Just let's go to after the crash. Let's go to after the plague. Let's go to after the oceans have risen and receded a bit, and now we have a smaller, manageable population, without talking about how we got there. And I think that just sort of that seeds the discussion in its entirety to the kinds of fascist and eco-fascist and ethno-nationalist kinds of approaches that you see modeled here in this book, right? And that are very, very open to talking about horrific solutions. So yeah, I don't know where to go with that. I don't want to say it's refreshing to come back, but it is interesting to see a book talking so openly about it in a way that books about our current situation often go way out of their length not to do.
So I definitely don't find Stand on Zanzibar refreshing, but I think so of course the moral panic of our time in some ways is depopulation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I know that David Runciman recently wrote a piece in the London Review of Books which was based around this, and the letters page ever since has been full of people saying, well, how dare you talk about this or talk about this in this particular way? Because depopulation is also a kind of Trojan horse for
right.
other sorts of discussion, but most notably, in the sort of fascist space that you're talking about, sort of ideas of racial purity and which race should have sort of more presence than others. This probably is the source of the kind of reluctance in present science fiction to talk about this. I think we see in some of the climate fiction ideas of degrowth. So, for example, in When There Are Wolves Again, it does seem quite clear, although I think that novel, at the end of the novel, so When There Are Wolves Again is set 80 years or so in the future, in the end, in Britain, where some real wilding has happened and things are a little bit better than we might have expected, and people get together for meet cutes over coffee, which seems to me like, I'm not sure that that's the way it will go, but, be great if it did. But there does seem to have been some depopulation. It's just not mentioned. And so we do see degrowth talked about, I think, a lot in SF. And there are also works that talk about aging populations. Strange Horizons did a recent special issue about aging in science fiction. For instance, the manga series Dementia 21 is set in Japan with an aging population and deals with some of the ways in which society might shift and change as a result. But in terms of overpopulation, I think the worry with it is twofold. The first is that you just go straight to eugenics, which is exactly what happens in Stand on Zanzibar. So we haven't mentioned it, but in the US of the novel, people are essentially pre-screened before they can have a child. And if the child doesn't fit certain requirements, they're just not allowed. They're not given a permit to reproduce, effectively. And we mentioned that Donald goes to Yarakang to find out whether a particular biological project is real or not, and that biological project also has a eugenics element. So that must be avoided. And Brunner doesn't, because he doesn't think about any of the other solutions. And I suppose the question comes back to what you were saying. The novel isn't really about overpopulation. It's about disgust with other humans. So what we should be, or what science fiction could reasonably do, is think about stuff like, well, let's genetically modify this particular type of wheat so we can grow more of it, right? Because that's the real way through, rather than talking about anything else. So I think there are elements of this sort of discussion that are happening in contemporary literature, but they're happening in very different ways. And I wonder if that's because science fiction itself is very, very different from what it was when John Brunner was writing.
In terms of its sort of like willingness to go after this sort of large-scale social imagining and that kind of dystopia, or there's a concreteness to the policies here, right? Where we know which genetic conditions and how they test for them, and there's that whole scene where one of the minor characters, I think, is it Peggy?
Mm-hmm.
Has to go to the doctor to get tested, right? She's pregnant. This mean old doctor just sort of reads off the list of here's all the things that we will make you abort the fetus, or we will sterilize you for all this stuff. And it feels like here in the US when Obama was mooting health insurance and the GOP got in a tizzy about like death panels, right? And like it feels like this sort of fantasy of a negative fantasy of like, here's how they will control you, in this very like, just like Brunner just like pulls on his like, we doing a dystopia now, hat. That's the thing that I'm saying. Like, I feel like I don't see a lot of people either positively or negatively thinking about really concrete approaches to population changes.
Yeah, I think part of that is certainly that a lot of contemporary SF is a little bit less granular in that way. So a lot of climate fiction, the climate stuff happens, I'm thinking of something like Private Rights, right?
Mm-hmm.
The climate is happening in the background. In the foreground are humans sort of living their life in this world, which actually is, I've said it's very different. It's not dissimilar to what Brunner does in that sense. But I think also because of what is happening to science fiction in terms of, Brunner comes to us from a very particular Anglo-American science fictional family tree, which is in part canonized by the Hugos, which it won Best Novel. And people like I did, right? I first read this book because it was in SF Masterworks. It was in SF Masterworks because it had won the Hugo. People read the history of science fiction according to that, but that's only one tradition. And I think of speculative fiction more generally. And I think in more recent years, other traditions have begun to be more clearly heard. And I'm not sure that some of those traditions are especially interested in thinking of overpopulation as a problem. So I think there's a question of emphasis as well. I know that Jack Ignati of Heroic Review of Books talks about, sort of hopeful futures, imagining better because you imagine differently, because you're drawing on different traditions. You draw on this tradition, as Cyberpunk did and whoever else does. It's an interesting question where this sits now in contemporary fiction. I'm thinking of, we're talking about overpopulation novels, something like Earth by David Brin is in that sort of sequence of things. Again, a conservative writer. I think I've ragged on David Brin on this podcast before, actually. Anyway,
I don't know if we have.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, I like to bring fresh takes.
I just wanted to throw in, I always love when you do see Brin on a panel. It's always interesting because he's always like the leftmost person on the panel, but it's just the other people on the panel are like Jerry Pournelle, it's like,
right.
Yeah.
So where this sits in the long tradition of Anglo-American science fiction is one question. Where science fiction is today is another. And in that disjuncture, we might find why there is no real standard bearer of this kind of treatment.
This is my hobby horse all the time. Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, a major work of science fiction by a major author, which was widely cited by many people and organizations as like one of the most important books about one of the most important topics of our times, using tools that only science fiction has, and wasn't even on the Hugo shortlist, right? Like, because that's just not where we're looking and thinking right now. And there's not a lot of other writers doing a similar kind of thing, like at least stylistically to what he's doing. It does almost feel like a separate tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah. A branched tradition, a tradition that used to be part of it now is maybe something else. We're not in this 2010. We're in this 2026.
We are. And, as I say, I think we should be on balance and despite everything, quite pleased about that.
We talked about, without really drilling down into it, the racism and misogyny of this book. And it is kind of fascinating how I think in a book today, you just couldn't get that level of racism and misogyny coming out of a character's mouth without having sort of like set them up as some sort of villain or something like that, just because our baseline multicultural victories are so much greater than we normally acknowledge. When you have, right. These swings to the far right around the world, here in the States, in Europe, lots of places, I think it's easy to forget how far we've come in 50, 60 years. And it's a long way.
It is. And maybe that's the energy that we got from reading Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner, right? Like, we're not there. And the things, because we did make some progress. I don't mean to put that in the past tense, by the way, but that's how it came out.
Dan, are we done? Are we done talking about this book?
Yeah, I think we are. You could talk for a lot longer about this book because this book is so long. But on the other hand, I think that it might not reward it. You can circle it for a long time, but I think it's a relatively easy book to get your head around.
I think it's coming back to what we started with, kind of where this sits, Brunner being so prolific, this being the one he's known for, the fact that this has you can clearly sketch the lines of influence this book has. I can almost picture it sort of like a bracket on the main channel, right? It's a little bit off. It doesn't feel like it's quite in it anymore, but it's interesting to see all these threads between it. Dan, before we go, where else can people find what you are up to?
Well, of course, at the reviews department of Strange Horizons. You can find me on Blue Sky, where I talk about the reviews department of Strange Horizons. Another thing that I will be doing around this time is Rosanna Pendlebury and I will be going through the Clark Award shortlist, and we will be, having some thoughts together about, again, awards and what they tell us and what they don't tell us and why they are useful and indeed why they are not in 1968 and indeed in 2026.
Wonderful. I look forward to reading that. So you two are going to motor through.
Well, we're sort of hopeful that we'll have read at least some of them, but the judges are going to play awful tricks on us and make sure that, we haven't, I think. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much, Dan. Always good to talk to you. We'll talk again soon. And again, folks, read Strange Horizons, read Snap Criticism, listen to Critical Friends. Dan, have a good one.
Thanks, Xella. You too.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartrahari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabriel Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, congrats! You may be good. A few different ways you can do that. You can join our Patreon. Throw us a couple bucks a month to keep the podcast and the magazine sustainable. You can hang out with us on Discord, and we've got a few other perks on the way. If you're interested in a book we mentioned on the podcast, buying from the bookshop link in our show notes or at the ARB website gets us a cut. It helps immensely if you just help get the word out about the show. Leaving a review, commenting, or sharing on your platform of choice, that really helps. And it's nice to know you're listening. Questions, suggestions, elaborate compliments, drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Blue Sky for however long that stays cool, and probably slightly past that. A whole Stand on Zanzibar episode, and I did not make even one Tenacious D reference, patting myself on the back. I also didn't put any Long Winters clips when Dan said that phrase, but I'm going to be honest, that temptation was easier to resist. This week, I am packing up to head to Michigan for the Science Fiction Research Association Conference. I'm planning to record an episode while I'm out there, but we will see what happens. The next book discussion on the schedule is Robert Shearman's Tiny Deaths with the critic Ian Mond. Lots more good stuff in the works. Check the website if you'd like to read ahead. As always, thanks for listening and stay critical out there.